educator here at Cornell Cooperative Extension, Ulster County. Um, we are going to record this presentation, so if you feel more comfortable with your screen off, that's totally fine. And our other meeting host is Stacy
Hi
Kraft, if you want
there.
to introduce
Stacy
yourself.
Kraft, Public Health Education Coordinator at the Ulster County Department of Health. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. And Anna?
I'm Anna Herod McGrew, environmental educator with CCE Ulster.
Thank you.
We're just going to do a little housekeeping. Again, if you could say hello, type your name, organization, role in the chat box. During the presentation and throughout the meeting, please stay muted just so we eliminate all of that background noise and get to hear the wonderful presentation. And if you do have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat box as they come up. And then there will be some time at the end of the presentation to answer those questions.
Thank you. And a brief agenda today. Introductions we're going to do in the chat. If you just introduce your name, organization, and your title or your role in that organization, that'd be super helpful. And then we have our very special workshop, Public Health for Everybody. We have a wonderful presenter, Reagan Chastain. She's a speaker, writer, and researcher with Weight and Healthcare is her website, so you could check that out. We're going to skip our stretch break today because we have a lot of really wonderful content that we want to get through. But I encourage everybody to take care of yourselves. If you want to stand up and just do a little stretch during the presentation, take care of yourself, drink some water, however you need to do that. And then we'll have a very brief facilitated networking session where you can share some upcoming programs or events, and then we'll be closing. So we look forward to it. Without further ado, I will introduce Reagan Chastain, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And then Reagan, you can introduce yourself. Oops, I hit share instead of unshare. Stop share. Very good.
Hey everyone, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's no small feat to put these things together, and I really appreciate all the work that goes into it. I'm super excited for everyone who's here today to talk about this. My name's Reagan Chastain. Pronouns are she, her. I'm a speaker, writer, researcher, and board certified patient advocate. My area of expertise is the intersections of weight science, weight stigma, health, and healthcare. And so today we're going to talk about public health for everybody, including what research and what lived experience tell us are best practices to engage folks without doing harm, especially folks of higher weights. So if you have questions that don't get answered, that you didn't want to ask in front of the group, that come to you in 2 weeks or 2 years, you can always email me. It's reagan@weightandhealthcare.com. And I pretty much live to talk about this stuff. So please feel free to reach out if I can ever be helpful. And with that, let's get this show on the road. So format-wise, we're going to talk about some research. We're going to give some practical tips. We're going to do the Q&A. Privilege is something I always want to talk about. Privilege, of course, is the opportunities and treatment that we receive. It's also the difficulties and barriers that we don't face when we live in a dominant rather than a marginalized identity. I have a lot of privilege as a white person, cisgender, currently able-bodied, neurotypical. I'm also marginalized as a fat person, as a queer person, as a woman. And one of the things that privilege can do is put us in a situation where we don't know what we don't know because we're not having the experiences of people who have marginalizations that are different than ours. And of course, it's our responsibility to proactively seek out and gain that information, understanding how do these folks want me to use my privilege to dismantle that privilege. And that's something I work really hard at, but it's also a place where I make mistakes and I fall short. And I'm always open to being called in or out on those mistakes. And finally, some of what I talk about today may be different than what you've heard, what you were taught, what you've taught others, what you are sure of. And I, in the 20 plus years that I've been studying this, have had all the reactions, right? Anger, defensiveness, incredulousness, denial. If that comes up for you, I just want to name that as valid and offer that as an invitation to explore further and dig deeper. And I'm always very happy to help with that. So again, please feel free to reach out. One of the ways that I think about this, we all sort of know the story of Galileo, that he created this telescope and he found out that the sun did not revolve around the earth, but rather the earth revolved around the sun. And they called him a heretic and they put him under house arrest, made him recant. Terrible. The part of that story that interests me is that they say that his contemporaries simply refused to look through the telescope. So they weren't saying this telescope is poorly made or your math is off. They were just wouldn't look. And so what I consider a lot of my work to be is giving folks an invitation to look through the telescope and to consider that what we believe about health and weight and their connections may be very different and much more complex than we've been led to believe. So I'll start with language. The terms obese and overweight, these are terms that were literally created for the express purpose of pathologizing bodies based on shared size, rather than shared symptomatology or cardiometabolic profile like we would typically see in a disease diagnosis. And the origin of pathologizing higher weight bodies in general, the origin of weight stigma in general, the origin of body mass index in specific is inextricably linked to racism and anti-Blackness. And we know this from scholars like Sabrina Strings and Fearing the Black Body, Deshaun Harrison and Belly of the Beast. And I absolutely urge you to read more from folks who write about this to learn how not only are these things inextricable and rooted in racism and anti-Blackness, but they continue to disproportionately impact these communities today. And so these terms are, by weight neutral health community, fat activism community, considered stigmatizing terms because they're terms that are used to pathologize bodies simply based on size rather than actual health status. The impact of this idea of pathologizing bodies based on size has been a massive profit to the weight loss industry, who have been the primary architects of this model. And that's a whole other hour and a half talk that I won't get too deeply into today, but it's almost impossible to overstate how much the weight loss industry has infiltrated and manipulated concepts around healthcare and public health and weight. A lot of stigma and oppression to people in these classifications has been part of the impact, and a lot of fractured relationships between higher weight people and the concepts of health and healthcare. So person first language, you may have heard this is being talked about a lot, that it is less stigmatizing to say a person with obesity or a person with overweight. And it's important to know that this does not come from weight inclusive health community, health at every size community, fat activism community. This came directly from the weight loss industry as part of their goal of pathologizing bodies based on size. And so there are a number of issues with this. First of all, it's co-opted from disability community, where there's a lot of conversation and transformation. And again, I really recommend reading and listening to folks from that community to understand all those nuances. But absent any of those nuances, the weight loss industry took this idea and kind of plopped it onto higher weight people. And the other big problem with this is that it's actually more stigmatizing, because we don't talk about bodies like this, right? I've never said, oh gosh, I hope my friend with tallness comes by today because they can help me change that light bulb. Or, oh, my friend with blondness is sitting there, so unfortunately that seat's taken. Or, oh, do you see that man affected by thinness getting on the bus? I think I know him. This isn't how we talk about bodies. And so when we suggest that simply accurately describing higher weight bodies is so terrible that it needs a semantic workaround, that in fact creates weight stigma and perpetuates weight stigma. And so while it's being marketed as anti-stigma language, it is in fact weight loss industry marketing language, and it is stigmatizing. And so again, this is language that I don't use, and that's really rejected by communities that actually seek for support and liberation and anti-stigma around weight. So if we want non-stigmatizing language, we're looking for language that accurately describes these bodies without pathologizing or medicalizing them. So, and also terms that don't trigger or upset folks, that weren't used as a slur in the past. So terms like higher weight, people of size, larger bodies. And then there's reclaiming language. And by that, I mean fat. And fat is my personal preferred descriptor. And part of the reason I like it is because it's reclaiming language. It kind of tells my bullies they can't have my lunch money anymore. Right? You can't offend me by simply accurately describing my body. But it has all the complexities of any reclaiming term. There are people who could be described as fat who absolutely do not align with that as a descriptor for themselves, and that's completely valid. And so I'm not suggesting that at this point you just call people fat. But what I am saying is that it's incredibly important that if somebody does call themselves fat, as a positive or neutral descriptor, that we're never correcting them or saying, don't call yourself that, or you're not fat, because we're fat whether we choose to align with the term or not. And so making fat into a bad thing, again, perpetuates weight stigma for everyone, whether or not they align with that term. So throughout this talk, I'll use quote obese and quote overweight when I'm talking about studies that use those terms. I will use higher weight, people size, larger bodies, and fat interchangeably. And I won't use person first language for higher weight people. All right, let's get into the idea of weight bias and stigma and how we can see it and identify it. So weight bias is the belief that a thinner body is better, healthier, more attractive, more valuable, etc., than a fatter body. And this can vary among cultures and subcultures. And weight bias often leads to weight stigma. So bias is sort of the beliefs and thoughts, and stigma is the action. But within the research, even within weight stigma research, we often use these terms interchangeably. And so we'll also do that today. In terms of types of bias, implicit bias is subconscious. It means we're not aware that we are acting from this bias, and poor treatment of higher weight people can be unintentional. And we live in a society with a massive amount of weight bias coming at us in every form. And so if we internalize some of that and we're acting on it subconsciously, that would not be like a galloping shock. But we are still responsible for finding and dismantling that bias so that we're not even unintentionally doing harm. Explicit bias is conscious weight stigma bias. Here, the person is aware of their stereotypes or negative beliefs about higher weight people, and their poor treatment of higher weight people is intentional. Then there's internalized bias. This happens when a higher weight person internalizes negative beliefs about their own body. And this can cause them to participate in their own oppression. It can also cause them to participate in the oppression of other higher weight people, often to try to get some better treatment or to gain access to some privilege by saying, basically, like, I'm not like those other fat people. So weight stigma then is stereotyping, discrimination, and or unequal treatment of higher weight people. This can include unfair judgment, unfair treatment, social exclusion, and again, it's typically driven by weight bias. And one of the most harmful types of weight stigma rather is structural weight stigma. Structural weight stigma happens when the things that higher weight people need or want fail to include or accommodate them. Examples are chairs, right? Not having armless or wide enough sturdy chairs, blood pressure cuffs, medical research, best practices, MRIs, and then just in public restaurant booths, theater seats, cars, etc. Fitness spaces are another example of this. And this type of stigma, it is exacerbated when the body is blamed for the lack of accommodation, right? Which would be if to tell somebody, oh, you're too big for the MRI, rather than being clear that the MRI fails to accommodate you. When we blame the body and not the lack of inclusion and accommodation, that also perpetuates stigma. And now all types of weight stigma are systemic in some ways, but structural weight stigma can only be solved systemically. In healthcare, for example, you can have a completely fat affirming provider, a completely fat affirming patient, but if that MRI does not accommodate, that patient cannot get a scan, right? This cannot be solved through resilience or through simply educating about weight stigma. This is about built environment and about inclusion and accommodation. And so it has to be solved systemically. Weight bias and stigma are also progressive. So they can impact people of all sizes. For example, someone that we would think is thin might experience weight stigma and bias if they're, trying to be a professional ballerina. So it can impact people of all sizes. However, as a person's size increases, so does their exposure to weight stigma and bias. And this is particularly true for structural stigma and bias for those at the highest weights who often self-identify as super fat or infinifat. And this can be things like a lack of clothing options in stores or online, less accommodation in medical equipment, not being accommodated in public spaces and transportation, including spaces meant for health support like fitness spaces, like farmers markets, etc. And so the harm of weight stigma and bias is always going to be worse on those of the highest weights and those of multiple marginalized identities, and in particular, folks of color. And again, I go back to scholars like Sabrina Strings, Deshaun Harrison, to talk about and understand those implications. So in public health messaging, let's look at some specific examples. This was an ad put out by Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. These were on billboards, bus shelter signs, and television commercials. And they were a series of ads, and they all sort of looked like this. It was kind of higher weight kids in black and white, looking sad and kind of ill-fitting clothes with sayings like, as this one says, warning, being fat takes the fun out of being a kid. And Children's Healthcare of Atlanta had just opened a wing that was specifically a program specifically meant for weight management of children. So this was advertising for them. And so higher weight kids saw these everywhere they went. Every kid who interacted with higher weight kids saw these. Parents and adults saw these. And so it created this messaging that you should look at a higher weight child and assume that their weight is ruining their lives. And if you are a higher weight child, you should assume that your weight is ruining your life. And so this obviously creates a massive amount of stigma. And as we'll see, also unintentional harm. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. First, I'm going to mute and cough. So then this was put out by the New York City Department of Health, and these are older campaigns, but I think it's so important. These were huge in subways, like these huge ads within the New York City subway system. And this one says, portions have grown, so has type 2 diabetes, which can lead to amputations. And then there's progressively larger cups of soda. And I want to say these are like some pretty big leaps from portions to type 2 diabetes to amputations. And in the background, we have a higher weight person of color with a below the knee amputation and crutches in the background. And so what I want to point out here is that it makes a higher weight person of color a cautionary tale. And what it says subconsciously is if you see someone who looks like this, you can go ahead and assume that they've made the quote poor or quote wrong choices, even though we know that people of all sizes and people of all races and ethnicities drink sodas of all sizes, right? It makes this person a cautionary tale, and it does it very intentionally. And the way I know that is that this comes from stock footage, and the person in this picture, this gentleman, is not actually an amputee and does not have type 2 diabetes. And so they took the stock footage of him and they purposefully made him disabled for this messaging. And that's problematic in a number of ways, but it's creating multiple layers of stigma, including racism, around this ad campaign that is intended for public health. And I think the people who make these campaigns aren't necessarily poorly intended, but we have to look at the impact and not just the intent. This is another from that same group. This one says portions have grown, so has quote obesity, which can lead to many health problems. And now we have progressively larger hamburgers. And in the background, we have a higher weight woman of color on a mobility scooter. And so here again, a disabled higher weight person of color is made into the cautionary tale, right? This person is just trying to live her best life on her scooter in a crosswalk. And now she's the picture of eating too many or too large cheeseburgers. And so again, this actually generates quite a bit of stigma, and as we'll see, is unlikely to have a positive effect on behaviors. So this is a new thing that I want folks to be looking out for. So you'll see Novo Nordisk has this Escape the Stigma program, or Juniper has the Don't Weigh In on My Weight, and they're calling these anti-stigma campaigns, but they're actually weight loss marketing. And so the goal is to create this idea that is actually a co-option of true anti-weight stigma messaging. And the message that comes through these co-opted and quote unquote anti-weight stigma messages is we shouldn't treat higher weight people badly, but we should actively promote a world where they don't exist through a concerted international effort to eradicate higher weight people and prevent any more from existing. But in a non-stigmatizing way. And that is not a thing. One of the things that's important to understand is the pathologization of higher weight bodies is stigmatization of higher weight bodies. And you cannot suggest that the world will be better with higher weight people in it, or that the world is worse if more higher weight people are in it, and still be doing anti-stigma work, right? You can't say we want to treat you better, but in the hopes that eventually you won't exist in your current form. That's not an anti-stigma message. So as I said, I think the people who, with possibly the exception of the weight loss industry, I think people in public health who are creating these messages aren't ill-intentioned. but I think there are unintended consequences of perpetuating weight stigma in public health promotion and education that we have to be noticing. And that includes increased disease risk through increased stress, triggering of eating disorders, and lowered personal health and healthcare engagement. And we'll look at each of these individually. So in terms of increased disease risk through increased stress, weight stigma has been shown to create health issues in and of itself. So, and this is not new information. This is Munich et al. From 2008 found that cis women who say they feel they're too heavy suffer more mental and physical illness than cis women who say they feel fine about their size, no matter what they weigh. And I want to take a second to point out that in this study, as in almost every study I'll talk about today, there is no trans and non-binary representation and an underrepresentation of people of color. And that has been a consistent problem in research that never should have happened in the first place and certainly should have been solved by now, but remains an issue. So another study from Munich, again in 2008, so not new information, was that experiencing weight stigma over time was associated with increased rates of high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. Pull et al. Found weight stigma to be linked to increased blood pressure, blood sugar, and levels of cortisol, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicidal tendencies, more advanced and poorly controlled chronic disease, and low health-related quality of life. And Sutton et al. Found that perceived weight discrimination was associated with an increase in mortality of nearly 60%. And this is important because weight stigma is a confounder in this relationship between higher weight and health. We often get told higher weight causes decreased health. And you'll even hear terms like, quote, obesity related or weight related health issues. But in fact, what we may be looking at in part, at least, is weight stigma related health issues, where higher weight people are exposed to stigma, but the negative impacts of that get blamed on their weight. And so again, even though the stigma that's created by these public health campaigns might be unintentional, it still can be creating significant harm. And messaging matters. Himmelstein et al. Found that young women who were told in an experiment that their weights, quote, weren't ideal, experienced higher levels of cortisol regardless of their actual size. And in fact, just reading news reports about the supposed health risks of larger bodies leads to greater anti-fat prejudice and greater support for and willingness to discriminate against fat people. And these news reports, we are deluged with them on a daily basis. And this holds true, by the way, even if an explicit anti-weight stigma message was included. And so this again is important to that idea of these messages that say, oh, higher weight is bad, but we shouldn't treat higher weight people badly. This is still generating prejudice, it's still generating discrimination, and it's still generating the harms of weight stigma. So triggering eating disorders. One example of this is the 2020 BEAT report, which found that government-sanctioned anti-quote obesity campaigns increase the vulnerability of those at risk of developing an eating disorder, exacerbate eating disorder symptoms in those already diagnosed with an eating disorder, and showed little success at reducing quote obesity. And we'll find that that is a commonality. Right? These campaigns show little to no success at changing people's body size, but they do, or behaviors, but they do significant harm. They note that strategies including changes to menus and food labels, information around, quote, healthy and unhealthy foods, and school-based weight management programs all pose the risk. Sorry, coughing again. All right, lower personal health care and engagement. So Pull et al. Looked at public perceptions of these obesity-related health messages. And again, I'm using these studies on purpose because this is information that we've had since at least 2013. So this is, again, not new information. What they found was that messages that have been publicly criticized for stigmatizing content received the most negative ratings and the lowest intentions to comply with the message content. And so even in weight stigma research itself, there are dangers that I want to point out as we're using this research to create programs. Weight stigma research itself can be based in and create additional stigma. It can use stigmatizing terms and pictures, terms like obese, overweight, excess weight, or epidemic, right? Calling people an epidemic or a pandemic for existing. Funding conflicts, we often find that these are funded by the weight loss industry. The Rudd Center, for example, takes a ton of money from the weight loss industry. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly have their own campaigns. And often there are representation issues where, again, either folks of color, trans and non-binary people, and the higher or highest weight people either aren't represented at all or are represented as cautionary tales or the most possible negative representation, right? Where we just see, we call it the headless fatty picture, where it's just somebody's midriff with a tape measure around it or carrying bags of fast food, again, generating that kind of ill thought and stigma around fat people. And the research itself often underrepresents these folks. Often this research can take and support views that are in and of themselves stigmatizing, right? So they'll say, oh, we should reduce weight stigma because weight stigma might create weight gain. So the idea that people might be higher weight and we want to prevent that, again, is stigma. Or that weight stigma is bad because it makes people less likely to participate in or comply with weight loss interventions. Again, weight stigma is bad because it's harmful and it's stigmatizing, not because it might make people opt out of trying to change themselves to suit their oppressors or an ideal of health or beauty that is based on size. And so then the researchers who are typically thin and typically white get centered as weight stigma experts over actual weight stigma experts who are higher weight, who have lived experience, and who are coming from a place of depathologization as anti-weight stigma. So we've got this cycle of harm in weight stigma and that comes from these sort of anti-obesity, quote unquote, messages. And it's that we pathologize body size, right? And then public health seeks to entice people to change their body size or to take actions in the hopes they can change their body size. That creates weight stigma. Weight stigma creates lowered health engagement, and then negative outcomes to health come from that. And then those negative outcomes are used to justify pathologizing body size. And so it becomes this vicious cycle that harms higher weight people at every aspect. So I want to talk about the ethics of promoting weight loss and an anti-quote obesity focus. And I'm going to start with how I got into all of this. So I've been doing this now for over 20 years. And I started all of this trying to find the best diet, the best method of weight loss. And my background, of course, is research methods and statistics. So I decided that the best way to do this was to do a literature review of all of the weight loss research. And I cannot stress enough, I was not in school at the time. I did not publish. I had a corporate job. This is just the kind of mega nerd that I am, that this is like how I solve my life problems. And so I did this huge literature review and I got to the end and I was so surprised about what I found that I did the entire literature review a second time. And when I say I had all the feelings, right? Denial, anger, disbelief, incredulousness, all of that. And so what I felt made sense because what I had been told was not what was represented in the research. And what I found is sort of summarized by this quote that I'll read for us. There isn't even one peer-reviewed controlled clinical study of any intentional weight loss diet that proves that people can be successful at long-term significant weight loss. No commercial program, clinical program, or research model has been able to demonstrate significant long-term weight loss for more than a small fraction of the participants. Given the potential dangers of weight cycling and repeated failure, it is unscientific and unethical to support the continued use of dieting as an intervention for, quote, obesity. And that's Wayne Miller out of George Washington University. That was true 20 years ago. That is true today. And it's, again, not new information. Stunkert et al. In 1959 found that a more than 95% failure rate in a group of 100 participants in a hospital weight loss program. They also looked at the previous 30 years of research and found the same thing. So we're talking now about research starting in the 1920s. In 1992, the U.S. National Institutes of Health issued a statement that admitted that almost everyone who loses weight regains it. 99 replicated by Miller, 2007 Manitou Miyama, 2013 the Australian National Medical Health and Research Council put this out as A-level evidence, which is to say there is sure that almost everyone regains weight as there that smoking causes cancer. 2020, a Canadian, quote, obesity expert panel admitted this, 2021, Gazer and Angotti, and just recently Wheeldryer et al. Came to the same conclusion. So now we're talking about 100 years of research that finds that these behavior-based weight loss interventions almost never create significant long-term weight loss. And this is to a large extent true also for weight loss drugs and surgeries, but that is a totally separate conversation and a totally separate hour and a half talks. So we're going to stick today to talking about the behavior-based programs because that's typically what public health is suggesting. The research finds almost everyone loses weight in about a year. Almost everyone regains that weight in 2 to 5 years, and up to 66% of people regain more weight than they lost. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being fat or becoming fatter. I'm saying there's something seriously wrong with something that's considered a public health and healthcare intervention that's recommended to about 70% of the people that has the opposite of the intended effect the majority of the time. And that's what we're talking about with these behavior-based interventions. And failure of these interventions, and to be clear, it's not a failure of the people, it is a failure of the intervention, is not benign. Gazer and Angotti found that the risks associated with weight cycling are very much the same as those associated with, quote, obesity. Bacon and Affermore found that attempts to lose weight typically result in weight cycling, as we've seen, that weight cycling results in increased inflammation, which is known to increase risk for many, quote, obesity-associated diseases. And research also finds that weight fluctuation is associated with poorer cardiovascular outcomes and increased mortality risk. In fact, they found that weight cycling could account for all of the excess mortality that was associated with, quote, obesity in both Framingham and the Haynes. And so again, when we hear about these quote unquote obesity related or weight related diseases, what we might actually be talking about are weight cycling related health issues. So when it comes to kids and weight management, Newmark Steiner found none of the behaviors being used by adolescents for weight control purposes predicted weight loss. Of greater concern were the negative outcomes associated with dieting and the use of unhealthful weight control behaviors. Fiona Willer found that dieting to a weight goal was found to be related to poorer dietary quality, poorer mental health, and poorer quality of life when compared with people who were health conscious but not weight conscious. All right, so that was the Debbie Downer part of the talk. Now let's talk about what can we do and what can we change. So what we're talking about here is a change in focus, that we move from focusing on weight and manipulating weight to focusing on health and supporting health in people of all sizes. We move from quote unquote obesity prevention to health support. And that we shift the focus from impacting individual action to removing systemic barriers, improving access, and improving social determinants of health. So there are lots of benefits for a health versus a weight loss type of messaging. First, it avoids a double disservice. When we focus on weight, we tell higher weight people that the only way to improve their health is to change their body size, which is not what the research says. But we also can miss health issues in thin people, or thin people can miss them in themselves or choose not to go for screenings because they assume that because they're not higher weight, they are healthy by virtue of their size. So that's a double disservice that we can eliminate when we focus on health for people of all sizes rather than focusing on weight loss. It avoids reinforcement of public shame and stigma, including unintentionally through public health messaging. It creates a belief in fat bodies as worthy and deserving of care, both in higher weight people and in healthcare providers and other people who care for them, which is incredibly important. And it establishes positive relationships between people of size and healthcare providers and public health campaigns. So Matheson et al. Took a look at this, and they looked at 4 healthy lifestyle habits in 11,761 cis men and women. And the habits they looked at were 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables, exercise more than 12 times a month, alcohol up to 1 drink a day for cis women and 2 drinks a day for cis men, and not smoking. And again, here, underrepresentation of people of color and no representation of trans and non-binary folks. And so here we have their findings. We've got the health hazard ratio, and then the number of those 4 habits they were participating in from 0 to 4. And on top of each of those, we have 3 graphs. The first is for quote unquote normal weight, the second for quote unquote overweight, and the third for quote unquote obese. And what they found was when people were participating in none of those 4 habits, there was a pretty big striation among health hazard ratios, with health hazard ratio becoming higher for those who have higher weights. However, it's important to understand we cannot say that this is caused by body size, again, because of those confounding variables, but we do see that it's there. When people were participating in one of those habits, that difference compressed significantly. By the time they were participating in all four, health hazard ratios were the same, regardless of body size. And I've chosen this study because of time. There are many others, and it's important to know that when we actually take behaviors into account, they are a far better predictor of current and future health than is weight or weight loss. And in fact, studies including Man, Alstrom, and Tomiyama when they look at these small amounts, 5 to 10% weight loss, to see, does this actually create health benefits? What they find is that the weight loss itself is not what's creating the health benefits, but rather the health supporting behaviors that people engage in. And so if we take the weight loss component out and just leave the health supporting behaviors, we can help people get the same physical and mental health benefits with far less risk. So going back to that pool study that we looked at earlier, they found that messages that were perceived to be the most positive and the most motivating, right? So the messages people were most likely to use as motivation for their own behaviors were positive, made no mention of the word, quote, obesity at all. And instead rather focused on making healthy behavioral changes without referencing body weight. So again, the messages that were most positive and most motivating made no mention of, quote, obesity, and instead focused on making healthy behavioral changes without referencing body weight. They also found that participants responded most favorably to messages involving themes of increased fruit and vegetable consumption and general messages involving multiple health behaviors. Right, so messages that focused on health supporting behaviors rather than focusing on weight or weight loss. So what messaging works? Shame-free, blame-free, future-oriented. Positive behavior-based, multiple aspects and options, and weight neutral. And so multiple aspects and options is also really important because what's easy or easier for someone to do might be much more difficult for someone else. And so rather than having just the singular messages, the more options we give folks for health supporting behaviors, the more they can engage. And the more they engage, we find then the more they are, seeing the health results, the more they are open to engaging in additional behaviors. And so multiple aspects and options across research is an incredibly important aspect of this. Some positive examples. So this is from the Nutrition Incentive Hub's 2022 National Convening. And these are folks who work to get people access to fruits and vegetables. And as we can see here, it's just happy people with vegetables, right? And we see people of color and higher weight people as service providers and not just service receivers, which is also important. But there's no like donut with a line through it. There's no like headless fatty, just happy people with vegetables. Here's another one. Need a snack? Grab an apple from the calf. So this is just really clear. Like this is an option. Here's where to get it. Again, no donut with a line through it. No, picture of a higher weight person in black and white, all sad. Just here's where you can get an apple. This is another interesting example. So this looks at different foods and how they can impact health directly, again, without that weight loss message, so that people of all sizes can benefit from this. And so it's not unintentionally creating weight stigma. Gazer and Gotti, when it comes to physical activity, this is a really interesting study. So they analyzed 225 studies and meta-analyses about weight, physical activity, and health. So it's a huge study. They found that the mortality risk associated with, quote, obesity is largely attenuated or eliminated by moderate to high levels of cardiorespiratory fitness or physical activity. They also found that weight loss, even when it is intentional, is not consistently associated with lower mortality risk. And that's important because that's an assumption that gets made. If you lose weight, your mortality risk will be better. And that's not what the research shows consistently. In fact, they found that increases in cardiorespiratory fitness or physical activity are consistently associated with greater reductions in mortality risk than intentional weight loss. They found again that weight cycling is associated with numerous adverse health outcomes, including increased mortality. And of course, weight cycling is the outcome of the vast majority of weight loss attempts. And they posited that adherence to physical activity might improve if healthcare professionals emphasize the myriad benefits of physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness in the absence of weight loss. And this is important because the message that higher weight people get is that exercise makes you healthier because it makes you thinner. And so they start an exercise program, they lose a little bit of weight, then they plateau and gain it back, the vast majority, and then they're likely to just quit, right? We see that disengagement from care because it's hard enough to make time for movement and exercise and fitness, let alone if you think it's not doing you any good. And so being clear that the benefits of physical activity are direct. Now, to be clear, nobody is obligated to participate in fitness or any other health supporting behavior. My goal is that everybody who wants to participate is welcome and has clear and accurate information about the possible benefits. And including the fact that those benefits, again, are direct. They come directly from the movement. They don't come from whether or not the movement manipulates body size. So increasing access to movement in public health, creating inclusive movement programs that avoid weight stigma. And this can include multiple options for movement, including non-traditional movement options, right? And especially as in terms of also eliminating and avoiding ableism, right? So it's not a walk and run, it's a walk, run, and roll, for example, making sure that these messages are really inclusive, creating non-competitive options. And this isn't just for higher weight people, this is for people of all sizes. Within the fitness world, we see a lot of exclusion based on what is considered real fitness, quote unquote. And so having options that are non-competitive, where we're not choosing teams, these can make more inclusive options, encouraging people to move their bodies for fun and health. What we want to avoid is this messaging that gets put out so often that the purpose of movement or exercise or fitness is punishment for having a fat body or prevention of being or becoming fat, because that's generating a ton of stigma. And what we find is that it does not generate a ton of lasting motivation to actually participate in movement and fitness. So what personal steps can we take? First, becoming conscious of any negative stereotypes, thoughts, or assumptions we have about higher weight people. And there's an implicit bias test from Harvard that you can take as a start. You can also start to become conscious of your interactions with folks, your assumptions about folks, just, in your everyday life, professionally and personally. And I want to say, when you discover, as you inevitably will, we all harbor implicit biases, right? When you discover these, that's actually good news. It can be easy to go into a shame spiral about this, but in truth, if we don't recognize it, then it's just operating in the background and we're unintentionally doing harm. And so once we find it, that is good news. And it's okay to feel some shame about harm that we've created, right? I still hold a bunch of fitness certifications, but I started teaching group fitness classes when I was 18, and I was really into this weight equals health paradigm. And I did a massive amount of harm with my little Madonna mic in front of these classes. And I feel shame about that. And I think that's fine, but I don't want to get mired in that. What I want to do is learn, okay, what can I do and how can I do better, and start to mitigate that harm and start to perpetuate something better. We want to make sure we're never blaming higher weight people for accommodation failures. So if they come in for a public health promotion class and there are no chairs that accommodate them, we want to make sure to apologize, even if it's not our fault, right? Even if it's the facility, to say, I'm so sorry, there should be accommodating chairs, and then solve the problem. But we never want to say, you're too big for these chairs, or you're too big for this experience or this space, right? It's always, the space does not accommodate you, and I apologize. Question the weight-centric paradigm when you see it in lesson planning, right? Start to question, is this true? Is this accurate? Is this likely to promote engagement in public health, or is it more likely to promote harm and disengagement like we saw in earlier slides? And then finding ways to make substitutions and changes where you can, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And then support research around the weight neutral paradigm. If you yourself are a researcher, or if you are someone who has grants for research, supporting more research around what does a focus on health supporting behaviors create. So do's, general practical steps in public health campaigns. We want to separate the ideas of weight and health. So we want to avoid terms like healthy weight. There is no such thing as a healthy weight. There's no weight at which you'll be immortal unless or until you get hit by a bus. This is a huge misnomer. Again, focusing on healthy habits rather than habits that are meant to manipulate body size or for weight loss. And not just separating, but making sure we're not conflating body size and health. So there are healthy and unhealthy people, however we decide to define that, at every shape and size. You can have people of the exact same size, BMI, weight, whatever measurement you're using, with vastly different health statuses. And you can have people of very different weight sizes and BMIs with the exact same health status. So when we start to use weight as a proxy for health and weight loss or being thinner as a proxy for health improvement, we run into a lot of issues. Be aware of shaming and blaming language. So in public health campaigns, we don't want to use terms like tip the scales. We want to try to avoid obese and overweight, or things like, the weight of type 2 diabetes, the weight of unhealthy eating. We just want to make sure we're not in any way sort of creating an undercurrent of higher weight as a bad thing. Focus on how healthy behavior can support people of all sizes. And I would say too, this is particularly important in children. The idea of singling out higher weight children for intervention and creates a number of issues. And I've written about this pretty extensively. Again, this is a whole other talk, but ends up creating real issues with their relationships with food and movement and their own body. And again, misses students who are thinner, but might not be participating in these health supporting behaviors, or might have health issues that aren't being identified because they're not being screened as early and often because they're not higher weight. So focusing on healthy behaviors for folks of all sizes at all ages, demanding a rigorous evidence basis for all health recommendations. My primary audience is doctors, and I will do a 2-hour talk almost entirely with research about this. And the first question is, well, everybody knows that being higher weight is unhealthy, right? It's reached this everybody knows status where it's almost like no amount of research could possibly make people question it. And we have to question it because it's doing so much harm. And so demanding that rigorous evidence basis, and then centering the voices of higher weight people, especially those at the highest weight and multiply marginalized identities, so that these folks aren't being seen as intervened on, but we're centering and creating these weight inclusive, culturally competent messaging. Things to watch out for, things to avoid. So hidden health stigma and health initiatives and discussions are often things like pathologizing higher weight bodies, referring to higher weight people simply existing as a problem, as an epidemic, as a pandemic, as a crisis, etc. You cannot destigmatize people while saying that their existence is a crisis. And eradication, again, is stigma. So the idea that the world would be better if we had no higher weight people in it is in and of itself stigma. Higher weight people not being shown in positive ways, right? Again, those headless fatty pictures, those black and white, ill-fitting, sad kids, showing higher weight people, especially multiply marginalized higher weight people, higher weight disabled people of color as a cautionary tale. Those are things we want to watch out for. And if health promotions and campaigns don't have any fat positive higher weight people in leadership roles, right? Where they are teaching, where they are leading, where they are creating programs, then that is a red flag for weight stigma. Because if you're not in the room, then you can't influence what's happening. And again, depathologizing is destigmatizing. And this is from Fox et al. And Rachel Fox's research on weight stigma is incredible. I cannot recommend it enough. And they said all weight stigma interventions must begin from the premise that fatness is not pathological. Anything less is merely perpetuating the oppression of fat people at the hands of the institution of medicine. And I would add here in public health. And they end by saying weight stigma research should treat fat people the way that fat people would be treated in a world without weight stigma. And so again, pathologization of higher weight people is stigma of higher weight people. So final thoughts here around this. You can't do everything to solve weight stigma in public health messaging or anywhere. None of us can. And that can feel really overwhelming. But I guarantee you personally can do something. And so start to think about, where do you have privilege and power and leverage? And maybe you can't change the curriculum, but you can add a drop in that says it's actually this idea of weight and health being synonymous is controversial. And in fact, one option is to focus on healthy behaviors rather than focus on weight loss, right? Can you add a drop in? Can you push to change curriculum that you don't agree with? So where do you personally have power, privilege, and leverage? Can you make sure that the room you're going to be teaching has sturdy armless chairs? And then where can you build coalition to create more power and privilege and leverage? Right? How can you make that happen? And understand that what you do, anything you do, will make a real difference. And you may not know it. That's one of the things about doing this work. We have to consider doing the work to be the victory, because so often we can't control the outcome. And it's so easy to burn out when we're focused on whether or not what we did makes the change that we wanted. And so for me, this type of work, this type of inclusivity work, is a form of self-care. And so the victory is that we do the work. And when enough of us do it, we make change, right? But understand that even if you don't know it, what you do will make a real difference too. That one fat person sitting in that class who came in with all of this internalized fat phobia and heard from you for the first time the idea that their body is valid and worthy of care exactly as it is, and that they can support their health directly rather than trying for the 15th or 20th weight loss attempt of their life, which will almost inevitably end in weight cycling, right? You may never hear from that person, but you may change their life. And then as they talk to other people, you change more lives. So understand that it's not about doing everything. It's about figuring out, where is my locus of control to do something. Finally, before we head to the Q&A, even if I was wrong about everything, and I have to admit that's a possibility because that's how science works, even if fat people could all become thin, even if by becoming thinner we would all become healthier, fat people would still deserve equal accommodation and access to the world, including in public health, including in medical care. Fat people have the right to exist without shame, stigma, bullying, or oppression. It doesn't matter why they're fat. Doesn't matter if there are health outcomes of being fat. Doesn't matter if they could or even want to become thin. The world should affirm and welcome and accommodate higher weight bodies, because fat bodies exist, and because fat phobia and healthism and ableism are simply wrong. You made it. This is the Q&A. Again, please feel free to email me at weightandhealthcare.com if you have any questions. You can also message me on Instagram. For free resources, the HAES or Health at Every Size health sheets are diagnosis specific weight neutral care guides. You can download like type 2 diabetes and see what are the weight neutral ways to talk about and address this. There's also a one-sheeter on why we don't recommend weight loss if you're looking for something quick, and a resource bank there. And then weightandhealthcare.com is my Substack, and I just write about these things there endlessly. So you can always go and search the archive or just email me directly and I can set you up with any resources that I have that might help. So I will stop the share, and I am very excited for all of your questions. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. I know this is a lot.
Hi, Reagan. I'm Sophia. Here, let me put on my camera. I'm a medical student going into family medicine, and this was an amazing presentation. I'm really excited at all of the things that I learned about how I can carry out my clinical practice in a way that is supportive of the health of my vet patients or future patients, well, current and future. And I'm wondering, thank you for the resources. I'm also wondering if you ever like share some of this presentation that you give to doctors that you mentioned, like it's a little more focused on research.
I
Do people
suddenly
ever-
can't hear you. Hold,
Oh,
Sophia. I don't know if everybody's experiencing that or just me.
can you hear me
It
now?
might just be you. I heard her. So
Oh,
can you hear me, Reagan? Uh-oh. Hmm. We might have.
I can hear
okay.
now.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay,
And
Sophia,
you
do you
can
want
hear
to
me too.
just
This is Sophia.
repeat the, oh yeah. Go ahead, Sophia.
You can hear me, Reagan? Okay, great. I was just wondering if you have, if it would be possible to see some of the presentation that you give to physicians so I could, maybe save it, use it in my future work? Or do you ever like provide any of that information like on your Substack or any other resources?
I do. First, I want to make sure you know about Medical Students for Size Inclusivity.
Thank you.
MSSI, they have incredible resources, and I've worked with them on some resources. Also, the Association for Weight and Size Inclusive Medicine are awesome, AWSIM. I do a journal club for them, and I think they have those recordings on file as well. And then, yeah, just reach out to me and I will be happy to send you whatever I have that might be helpful. And thanks for being a medical student. I know this is not an easy road to hoe in any way, so huge appreciation. And
Danielle?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Mhm.
Okay, good. So hi, my name is Danielle. I'm the program coordinator for Pitch. We're a perinatal program in Ulster County. This is a question and I'm not sure if you can answer it or maybe just offer some guidance. So some of our Ulster County residents deliver at Northern Duchess Hospital. And we've gotten feedback that Northern Duchess's labor and delivery department, if a patient has a BMI over 50, they will not be able to deliver at the hospital. And the argument is that they don't have the proper anesthesia, like equipment to support that in case it's needed. However, within that same hospital, there are doctors performing gastric bypass and other weight loss surgeries that have, they're providing care to patients with much higher BMIs. But for some reason, when it comes to prenatal patients, people who are delivering, they're being turned away for their care, and a lot of them are being sent to Vassar Hospital, which is a whole nother thing. I'm just wondering if you can provide any guidance on how we can advocate for our participants who are really struggling with the fact that they can't deliver at a hospital with their provider that they've been working with throughout their pregnancy, and what maybe a conversation can look like with the labor and delivery department. I know it's probably like a big question, but just wanted to kind of pick your brain about it.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually doing a series right now on weight and healthcare about this idea of substituting weight loss for healthcare, where like they'll deny procedures that people need, but then refer them to weight loss surgery. And I successfully got a procedure. It was a gender affirming procedure for someone. They were denied their gender affirming care and referred to weight loss surgery for anesthesia risk. And the argument I made was, look, it's the same facility. Can whoever's going to do the anesthesia for the weight loss surgery just like come down the hall and do it for this procedure that the patient actually wants? And that actually worked. I don't know that it will ever work again, but it was a successful argument. I feel like in general, this is a coalition building issue. So if the patients and the providers and y'all can all create a push that, look, these patients deserve care, and it's not acceptable to say we just don't want to deliver babies for pregnant people who are over a certain BMI. Like, that's not ethical healthcare. And you obviously know how to care for these folks. You obviously do have the anesthesia that you need because you perform surgeries on people of much higher weight. So like, what can we do? Is it a funding issue? Is it a procurement issue? What's stopping you from providing ethical evidence-based care to all the patients who exist? Because right now in the healthcare system, it is perfectly allowable and acceptable for, in many cases, surgeons, anesthesiologists, facilities to say, we just don't want to provide care to fat people. And like, that's just our policy. And that's considered acceptable and ethical. It's something that I push against a lot in my own work. But with a coalition, you can sometimes create change, and going at it, even though it's really upsetting and wrong, going at it from a collaborative point of view, like, hey, it sounds like you don't have what you need to care for all the patients. How can we get that for you? Because the patients want to birth here, the doctors want to birth here, like we want to support this. How can we all come together and make sure everybody can have care? And coming at it from a collaborative perspective can be a helpful method.
Great, thank you so much.
And thanks for your work on that.
Yeah, Sylvie.
Hi. I don't even really know where to start. I was so excited to hear that Healthy Ulster Council was having you speak because I actually cited some of your work in a paper I wrote. I'm an MD and Master of Public Health joint degree student at SUNY Downstate. I'm also really excited that I was able to get my classmate Sophia in on this meeting to spread the knowledge about that. So this is amazing. I have some background in disability advocacy, but this area of advocacy is more new to me, but it's something I've been thinking about over the past few years of like weight or size does not equal health. I have some personal experience with that because I tend to have a smaller body than a lot of people, and sometimes people are like, "Oh, you're so healthy," or "You're so lucky that if you like eat, no matter how much you eat, you don't get bigger." And I'm like, but what if all the foods I'm eating are unhealthy and they're bad for me, even if I'm not getting bigger and stuff like that, or getting sucked into societal body image issues of like being thinner gives you more prestige or something like that. So I've had to battle with that internally. And I also have known a lot of friends and family members who are larger size people who've dealt with the stigma on that end. So I've kind of seen effects of the body weight stigma across the spectrum. Um, so I know I have a question in here. Um, sorry, I was very excited about this. Um, I yeah, I guess I would love to try to spread this to as many people as possible, which you kind of touched on. Um, Regrettably, in my paper, I did refer to there being an obesity epidemic, because I don't know, I found literature that described that, so I got stuck in that loop. Oh, I remembered my question. I'm so sorry. So that's a point that I obviously need to improve on because the paradigm I was working was still kind of off. So I'm really grateful you pointed that out. Um, my question was, and this is probably uh, like really something unpleasant to talk about, but you've probably seen some of those TV shows on TLC or something with very large size people, where I don't know, they get a crane and they have to take them out of their house or something. Obviously don't want to stigmatize them. Um, but I was wondering about your perspective on when size or weight itself could potentially maybe not be good for a person. Um, like just on that kind of extreme end.
Sure.
I
Sure.
really don't know how to phrase that without being offensive, so I apologize.
No, you did great. And this is a common question. So so here's the thing. First of all, I want to say I take a really firm view about bodily autonomy. And so I would never tell someone that they can or can't do something with their body, including attempt weight loss. I also take a really firm view of what constitutes the ethical evidence-based practice of medicine. And that's where I get in trouble with weight loss interventions, right? That they are not necessarily going to be effective for what the person wants to do. I worry, I want to give the folks on those shows the autonomy to choose to be on those shows, but I do worry about exploitation in general, and the idea that this is how fat people are perceived, right? There's no show happy fat people living their lives. It's all like, trauma type focus. And so health supporting behaviors are an option for people at all sizes. There is no size at which someone should lose the right to focus on health rather than weight. And this really does intersect with disability politics, right? There are people who have the same mobility challenges as the highest weight people in much lower weights. And of course, folks who have disabilities can have tremendous problems getting the things that they need, and that shouldn't be the case. For higher weight people, it gets worse and worse because it's usually exponentially more expensive if those mobility aids exist at all. And if somebody knows how to work with them to, for example, increase strength, stamina, and flexibility to improve mobility while simultaneously getting them the things they need for mobility right now. So my focus is always on what can we do to affect change so that people can have the life experiences they want, regardless of ability or disability and regardless of size. And so I never pathologize weight, even with, like, I do a lot of work in eating disorder community. Even though people with eating disorders can be very low weight, the weight is not the pathology. The eating disorder is the pathology. And of course, fat is not an eating disorder. Those aren't the same things. And fat people have all the same eating disorders as people of all sizes. But just as a comparison, pathologizing weight, I think, always ends up in a place where we're saying we're willing to risk this person's life and quality of life to make them thin. But we're not willing to give them other care that they may want that would help them have the independence and the experiences that they want to have. So I think we just have to be really careful, even at extremes, of suggesting that there's some point at which someone shouldn't exist in their current state.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
And I'll pass it to Veronica. Maybe this will possibly be the last question, and then we'll move on. However, I think we'll have a very abbreviated networking session where maybe we'll just enter things into the chat because we're having such rich discussion here that I don't want to cut this off. So, anyway, Veronica, go ahead.
Hello. I'm also a student, but I'm a nutrition and dietetics student, and I'm actually interning with Minette here at CCE. But I also intern at Northern Dutchess Hospital, and I love it there. I love all the providers. But I do come across this a lot when I'm at my rotation that the dietitians get like triggered or consulted from providers for like overweight and obesity and BMI frequently. And when it's like when you're seeing patients and you kind of like have to triage like what's the most important pertinent reason that they're there, and it's not because like they're not coming in because they're obese, like they're there for like an acute condition. So it feels like inappropriate to go and see a patient who was triggered by or consulted by the provider for obesity. And so I'm just curious because you said that you work a lot with doing in-service trainings for providers, and I'm wondering what is like the most effective messaging to providers, and like how do you like get their attention to like really optimize their time? Like how do you get them to like listen and like engage and like want to have that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in terms of like for the individual dietitians, it's about like what you say in the room. Like you might have been referred because the patient exists at a higher weight, but you can have a conversation about, hey, how are you feeling about your nutrition? How are you, you can have a weight neutral conversation at bedside with that patient. And then communicating with providers, I find it can help to sort of create that separate kind of expertise, right? So to say, I completely understand why you're consulting these patients for being higher weight, but what we find is that when we come in with recommendations around weight loss, it doesn't lead to any lasting behavior change. And in fact, it tends to make them disengage from dietetics care. And so the best thing we can do is, if you feel like the patient has questions about nutrition, or because there's also this assumption, right? If someone's fat, then they don't know anything about nutrition. And this happens to fat people all the time. I once had a doctor tell me that if I would just start walking 10 minutes a day, it would change my life. And I was in the middle of training for my first marathon, right? There's this assumption that you can just look at somebody and know, and that, thin patients don't need information about nutrition and fat patients have no information or are doing all the wrong things. So like there's that stereotype piece of it. And that kind of thing really requires like an in-service training and some time to like talk about research. That's a really hard one-on-one conversation to have. So if you're having it as like one-on-one rather than bringing in someone who's going to talk to the physicians, then just talking about the fact that they disengage from care, right? And that you have limited resources. And so not every higher weight patient needs nutrition information or needs a dietetics consult. And, maybe you can create like a list of ways, hey, if it's helpful, these are the things that we would suggest are like a reason to consult a patient rather than just straight, if you're fat, you're getting a visit from the dietetics department. And again, going back to patient care, you can also bring up Press Ganey scores, right? Patients tend to be less satisfied with care when they feel fat shamed while they're trying to recover from, pancreatitis or whatever. So maybe we don't do that. So that can also be a helpful way to kind of massage that conversation. We just want the, patients to have the best possible experience and to want to see us and talk to us and to have the best chance of engaging in healthy behaviors, and weight loss consults don't do that.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for
And
asking.
yeah, Kathy.
If you have time for this, Nanette, thank you. I'm a pediatrician by training and really appreciate your perspective. I'm also, I appreciate the focus on healthy behaviors. Your level of activity before age 5 is a very good predictor of your overall health, regardless of everything else. And yet, I have an N of 1 study where, in trying to address food allergies and food intolerances, I took out a whole bunch of what I would call inflammatory foods and lost about, I don't know how much, 40 or 50 pounds. And people keep saying, what are you doing? And I say, well, I'm eating healthy. And so I'm wondering, and that's just me, an N of 1, right? But are there places where we need to do better research so that we know what are the healthy behaviors and what are the messages we should be giving across the board? And is there any value to using weight or size as one of the indicators of possible areas for improvement in some of those behaviors? Does it track out that there's any difference in those healthy behaviors in populations of people? I guess bringing up some of this because we have so many young health professionals in this session today, and I just think there's so much room for further research on all of this. And so thank you for inspiring us all. And if you have any thoughts about, is there any positive use of making these measurements, let's say, in the clinician's office?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There is a lot more research to be done because so much of the research is focused on weight loss with an assumption that weight loss means better health, right? Without any mechanism to determine, was it actually the weight loss that improved health or was it the behavior change that was undergone? So there's a ton of research to do. In pediatrics in particular, it's interesting because the growth charts were never meant to diagnose. That came on later through weight loss industry influence, right? It was meant to be the physician looking at it and saying like, oh, if this kid was on a trajectory and then they shot off it one way or the other, like what happened here and is intervention necessary? But it was never meant to say, if you're at this percentage, you are pathological and you need intervention. And I did on weight and healthcare, I have a complete breakdown of the AAP guidelines and why I think they're deeply problematic. I was giving grand rounds at Nationwide Children's 3 days after they came out. So I was probably the first person to read through all of them and critique them. In general, I think the idea of conflating weight and health has little value. Because again, especially when we're not looking at confounders like weight cycling and weight stigma to see how much are these, creating this issue when we're assuming that the weight itself is a driver of ill health. And so in pediatrics, I think looking at those growth charts as a kid's natural trajectory, and then if there's a big diversion, that's a reason for concern. I think that it would do a better service to people of all sizes to focus on things like cardiometabolic health, mental health status, and look at supporting that and create research around supporting those things directly rather than a focus on weight. This is a really complicated answer that I'm trying to distill. Your question is a good one, and please feel free to reach out if there's anything else you want to chat about.
Wow, Reagan, thank you so much. This was, I think, incredibly helpful and probably very eye-opening for a lot of people. Um, I would love to continue this conversation, so I'm curious if anybody would be interested in having another meeting outside of Healthy Ulster Council over sometime in the next few months, just to kind of give space to explore this topic a little bit more. I see Sophia, you said yes in the chat. Um, and yeah, think of like how we can have some sort of collective action around this. So, first just like brainstorming kind of possible next steps or creating maybe a resource hub. I know, Reagan, you cited a lot of resources that already exist. So maybe if we kind of compile something that is relevant for Ulster County, that might be helpful. So if you are interested, please put your email in the chat. Um, and I will reach out. I'll also reach out to the whole group after this meeting and ask again if who might be interested in kind of coming together and um, yeah, seeing what we can do collectively. Okay, I see a few, perfect, a few emails in the chat, and again, I'll reach out later. I know everybody is very busy people, so we'll try to see like what we can do together because the hive mind works so much more efficiently than us individually. I am going to launch a poll just really quickly. Very simple. We do this every presentation just to see if this was relevant to your professional or personal life. I see you're getting a lot of shout outs in the chat too, so we appreciate that. So thank you for taking the poll, which just now I've lost I have way too many tabs open on my screen, so I'm like, where did it go? So I can There we go. Okay, we have 100% answered. Thank you very kindly. Okay, so I'm going to reshare my screen. We're going to shift gears just a little bit. And if anybody has, instead of doing our regular networking session, I would like you to put in the chat if you have any events or programs or anything coming up that you would like to share. We have our wonderful administrative assistant who is taking notes, so she will kind of splice through, the events and also people's emails for our collective action. And then I'm going to share the screen and slide. Zoom poll